Okay, welcome to Lecture 9 Screencast. So in today's Screencast, we're going to be covering brands and culture. So we're sort of thinking of brands in the global context, but also to a degree, we're thinking about the fact that we talked about earlier in the module how brands have meaning for consumers, and it's sort of where is that meaning derived from? So where does it come from? And specifically, who are thinking about how culture influences that. Um, but we're primarily thinking about brands from an international perspective, in the sense of, what are the considerations we need to think about when we're launching brands into a global environment. Okay, so we're going to start off by thinking about what is culture and looking at some definitions and deconstructing the concepts, breaking down what it is and what its component parts are, and what that all means. We're then going to think about the impacts of cultures in the sense of how does what we've talked about impact on branding specifically, and what are the considerations we need to take into account as a brand manager. And then we're going to talk about country of origin, which obviously can be really important for brands. So thinking about the places that brands are derived from and whether there's any benefit in leveraging that somehow into their brand identity. And then specifically look at this concept of consumer nationalism, where we're considering whether knowing the country of origin of a brand can sometimes be problematic for a brand. So it's not always beneficial. It can equally present brands with issues. We start off by thinking about what is culture. So when we talk about culture, what specifically do we mean? And we've got a definition here from Gates, which is important because, as we said earlier, in terms of branding and this idea that brands represent a cluster of meanings to consumers, culture is defined as this kind of a pattern of meaning in symbols. They're inherited and expressed in symbolic forms, and it's the way that we communicate, develop, and convey our knowledge, but also influences our attitudes towards life. So ultimately, what is and isn't important, how we should behave, all those kind of factors. So the idea that culture is all about meaning is really important here, because obviously what we've said earlier in the module is that brands are these clusters of meanings for consumers. So that starts to lead us to believe that, is our culture influencing what those meanings are? Or are the brands influencing what the culture looks like? What's the start and finish? It's really important we recognise the role of culture and our everything that influences us in society in terms of determining the sense that we make from the brands that we own as consumers, and then how do we use that as a brand, as a company, to influence how meaning around our brand is shaped and the form that it actually takes. So culture is clearly very important to branding, simply because we understand what brands mean to us because of our culture. And that ultimately leads us to believe that potentially if that cultural framework is different, then perhaps brands take on different and alternative meanings. So, breaking down the nature of culture a little bit further, culture is made up of beliefs and values. And these are really important in shaping the way that we make sense of what brands mean to us. So we talk about beliefs being these kind of mental and verbal processes that we hold, and they really reflect our knowledge and ultimately how we assess products and services, but also in that how we assess brands too. So it influences the things that we believe to be important about brands. So how we judge them, how we evaluate them, what do we hold to be important meaning. And then values are those kind of guides that what is appropriate behaviour in society. So how should we behave as consumers? So if you think about a lot of the stuff that we covered early in the module when we looked at those articles around the teenagers and the reasons they were buying brands, those reasons that they would give, and those influences, the rationale would derive from culture that they're a part of. And sometimes that can be a subculture within the kind of mainstream culture that tells them, that you must wear Nike trainers, or you must wear a certain brand of sportswear, and that might be part of the kind of subgroup that they align themselves with. But ultimately, all that kind of peer pressure and the things that we understand to tell us how we should feel about ourselves, so what makes us feel confident and what makes us have higher self-esteem due to brand ownership, is primarily down to the culture we're a part of. The culture determines the meaning, and therefore that that meaning tells us what's important in terms of the brands that we own. So from an organisational perspective, it's clearly really important that we understand how that is developing for consumers, so we can therefore influence the type of meaning that sits around our brand. And that, we've talked about image and identity, and this idea that we might have a strategic goal around our identity, and our image could be different from that, the way that we're perceived. And really, culture is kind of the intervener. It's what's influencing those image perceptions. So it's potentially what shapes and determines whether our image does reflect the identity that we want it to. So it's really important that we kind of have a really good understanding of culture and its implications. Again, here we have a framework from Sarathi, so we're looking at the different elements of cultures, and what's interesting here is you notice that the arrows are two-way. So this is not just about we have a culture and that culture determines the religion, it determines the language, it determines the values and attitudes. This is a two-way process. So as much as culture influences the values and attitudes, influence the culture. So it is really cyclical. And there are lots of academic theories that kind of, in terms of cultures of consumption, things that we buy, talk about, what influences that meaning. Is it derived from the organisation, or is it made from somewhere else? Is it culturally derived? And if it's culturally derived, where does that culture come from? And it is a little bit like a kind of chicken and egg scenario, where we're not sort of sure where one starts and another finishes. So it's kind of like, different brands can influence the culture in terms of consumption and what it's important for consumers to own, but equally the culture will help us understand what those brands mean. So it is very cyclical. So we've got all these different component parts of culture, and not only are they influenced by culture, but they influence the culture, and that's the really important point that you need to take away from this framework in particular. To start breaking down, different cultural contexts, are starting to look at this from an international perspective and differentiating initially by just low and high context cultures. So this is a few years old, but you can see that on the left hand side we've got our low context culture, which is kind of Western Europe, US, and then on the right hand side we have a high context culture. And it goes through how does this break down into what does it mean? So what are the implications, and therefore what are the implications for brands? So you can see that there's more elements of kind of independence and being a little bit different potentially in the low context cultures, whereas conformity and harmony and everybody fitting in and feeling the same is more of a characteristic of a high context culture. So it's important that we understand these, so that if we are operating in different cultures, we start to realise that actually, despite us thinking that our brand means the same, and we might have a global branding strategy, meaning that we operate the same strategy in every market that we're in, international or not, and you start to recognise that actually those perceptions could be different. So if you think about the idea of brand image, as we said earlier, being influenced by the culture. And we're now saying, actually, when we compare cultures, there are some discrete differences that surely will then influence the brand image that is perceived by the consumers. And it's interesting because most academics who talk about global brand management will say a truly global brand is a brand that is consistent across all of its markets. So, it retains the same imagery, it retains the same strategy. And what this is starting to suggest is, well, how does that then take account of local culture, and how does that actually work in terms of consumers deriving the same meaning, if we're saying that actually that meaning and what's important could be different because of the culture? We look at the continuum here, and this is specifically about communications. And if you think fundamentally part of developing the brand meaning is around communications and what we say about our brand, and we can see right from kind of low and high context cultures, which we talked about on the last slide, to explicit and implicit messaging. So this is really starting to give us a framework to shape how we might communicate meaning. So at one end of the scale, our messaging needs to be really clear and explicit, and it's important that we're not entering subtleties into the brand messaging. And at the other end of the scale, we can be really implicit. So we can be much more subtle in the things that we say, and the meaning can be derived in a different way. So again, it really begs the question: is that should global brand strategies be absolutely the same in every context? Because clearly we're seeing some quite different sort of context here. There's different elements to these cultures that are going to influence potentially how the brand is perceived. This idea of Hofstede, which I think you will have come across potentially, some of you, in Pallavi's marketing in a global context. So Hofstede has introduced this scale. His research was originally based on looking at organisational culture, but a little bit like we did a couple of lectures ago. But he was doing research that looked at IBM in a global context, and he was looking at how or whether managers in different areas of IBM, despite all working for the same organization, he was researching whether they kind of behave differently and trying to look at the kind of impact of organizational culture on global culture, and came up with these six different dimensions of culture. I mean, there is overlap. You'll probably see that as we talk through the different areas. So there's overlap between these different aspects, that without doubt. But it is interesting to break this down and start to have a look at the potential influence this might have on our branding strategies. Now, you obviously can go on the Hofstede website and you can compare different cultures, which is quite useful. And we're going to have a go at this in the seminar. So see, potentially trying to then work out and interpret what that might mean from a branding perspective, which is quite interesting. We're just going to talk through these different areas, and sort of potentially look at what the different impacts might be of these different dimensions on brand strategy. So starting off with power distance. So this essentially, according to Hofstede, is the extent to which we accept that some members of society are more powerful than others. So essentially that power is unequally distributed. So in a high power distance society, we really accept this, and it's interesting that brands can tap into this. If you think about a lot of luxury branding is essentially about enabling social mobility. So you might feel that because you can own a luxury brand, you might feel that by owning a luxury brand, you can essentially improve your social status and allow for social mobility. So it's kind of like luxury brands, and many brands are tapping into this idea that we want to challenge in some context the level of power distance. So we don't accept that actually that power may be distributed unequally. Okay, individualism versus collectivism. So again, this is something that we looked at on the earlier slide on the low and high context cultures. So this is very much around in a consumption context as to whether we conform. So is our society about conformity and fitting in and everybody feeling like they need to wear the same brands and not stand out and be different, or is it about us allowing for differences and being unique. So, to what extent do we want to express our individualism? And we know that brands are a key source of kind of identity and emotional self-expression. So again, they can tap into this, and it can be very important, particularly in societies where we might want to evoke that self-expression. Masculinity versus femininity. So these are around again, what are the dominant values in a society? So in a masculine society, it's all about achievement and success. So again, we know that this is something that brands are good at signifying. So driving a certain car, certain brands of car would enable someone to express their success in life and their sense of achievement. So again, brands can really tap into this, but equally it might influence what's important for us to represent in terms of our brand meaning and communication around the brand too. So equally that can be just as important. What kind of values are we conveying as part of our brand meaning, and how do they fit with the culture of that society? A little bit like we were saying with the implicit and explicit theory, there's one of the factors is the level of uncertainty that we can deal with in our culture. So you can see here on two different types of brand communications, one which is really explicit and goes through kind of really clearly the attributes, the benefits that the brand presents, and one which is much more implicit. So they're advertising for very similar branded products, and yet one can be considered to be much more ambiguous. So again, it's around our sort of brand communications and messaging and how we develop that meaning, and how that meaning then might be impacted and translated by a culture. So clearly in a culture with high uncertainty avoidance, the advert to the right might be perceived to be misunderstood, and that kind of meaning may not be derived effectively. So it's really important that we take these points into consideration, particularly when thinking about communications. Long or short term orientation. So, what's important in a culture? Is it today and tomorrow, or is it, sort of the future? And again, the kind of rationale and the meanings and associations we build around our brand can be impacted here. So, do we need to be thinking about how our brand might develop a long-term relationship with our consumers, or is it very kind of short-term? And is it about kind of indulgence? Which we come on to in the next slide, I think. So, indulgence and restraint. So it's kind of like how fun can we be, and how restrained do we need to be? Are we a society and culture that enables free gratification, or is this all about restraint and sort of holding back a bit? So again, we need to carefully consider the potential impact this might have on how we develop our brand image and the meaning that surrounds our brand. See here, this is the website that I mentioned earlier, which I'm sure you're familiar with. You probably would have had a look at this in the Marketing in a Global Context module, I think, those of you that do that module. But you can go onto a website and you can look at the different dimensions. So you can see here how we're comparing Sweden with China, and it gives you the rating for each specific country on the different aspects of the scale, but then also gives you some explanatory narrative, which can be quite useful in evaluating the potential impacts that these different aspects could have on a brand strategy. So it's important that this is something you recognise might also be useful for your marketing in a global context assignments too. Personality quite a bit in the module, and its kind of relative importance from a strategy perspective. and you can see here that these academics are arguing that this can be really unifying. So it can be something that sort of brings consumers together in a kind of global environment. And as you can see, also some other academics note that, as I said earlier in the screencast, that a consistent image is what academics often use to determine whether a brand is successful in global markets and whether they would consider it to be a truly global brand. But interestingly, Foch et al. Did this research where they looked specifically at the brand Red Bull, and they looked at that brand in 6 different nations. I've put the link to this article in the culture section of the Blackboard site. It's a really useful article because actually what it's saying is that even though Red Bull have a global brand image and positioning in global markets, so essentially they do the same in every single market that they're in, the perceptions, when they measured perceptions, so ultimately looking at brand image, were really quite different because of culture. So what they're arguing, what I'm trying to show here on this little diagram, is that you've got the brand identity, but when you bring that together with the culture, that therefore has an impact on consumer perceptions. Sorry, my presentation's been a bit crazy. I'm going to try and show you that consumer perceptions down there at the bottom. So it's really, what this research is telling us, it's really important that we don't ignore culture, and we do need to take account for it. So ultimately, if we want our brand to have the same perception and the same image in every single market, then we need to we need to take account of local culture and also local competition, because we're not going to encounter the same brands. If we talk about ideas of positioning being relative, ultimately you're not going to be competing against the same brands in every single market. There will be different competitors, which might then have an impact on your positioning as a brand too. So have a look at that article. It's really interesting and it could be useful for the modules as well. And it's saying ultimately that despite whatever we might think, their research kind of verifies this idea that culture does have an impact on the way that our brands are perceived, whether we like it or not, and in despite our global brand strategies. Factors and things to remember about culture is it's not stagnant, so it does change, and these are some of the factors that elicit cultural change. So it can be economic, so in times of decline, it could be technology and kind of contemporary ways of behaving. When markets become mature, it could be new generations bring new things to the table and new ideas. And sometimes with this idea of a zeitgeist, where there's a kind of like a big change in the way that we think about things. So, for example, the Me Too movement, and that can then determine what is seen as appropriate and shapes the values and beliefs and attitudes that we know derive from culture. So it's important to recognise that different cultures can be at different stages in terms of their maturity, and equally that culture changes over time, and that we need to take account for that. So accounting for culture at a snapshot in time is obviously helpful and useful, but we need to remember that, like everything, that environment changes, it's dynamic, and we need to constantly be aware of what those cultural changes might be, and because ultimately they will impact on our brand meaning and subsequent image. So we can look at the idea of country of origin effect as well. So not only thinking about culture from the markets we go into, but the culture of where we derive from. So we've got our country of origin, the brand origin, and when we bring to that together, we might leverage that and have a country of origin brand. So where our brand is very much leveraging its country of origin as part of its meaning and image. And it's important because it can help us make evaluations. So country of origin can be important in the sense that when brands are unfamiliar in new markets, and the country is, that can help consumers make connections. So if there are favourable attributes that are associated. So if we think of if you think of Paris and France, very much associated with kind of luxury brands and cosmetics, which can then mean that, something that's a brand that's leveraging its French origin, it has that level of familiarity already, so it enables the consumer to make positive evaluations based on that familiarity, and makes it kind of helps with brand awareness and acceptance in a new marketplace as well, which obviously can be really important. So there are certain countries, German luxury automobiles, California, very sort of Silicon Valley associated with information technology. So there are some important associations there. Now, Laforet does a great chapter on country of origin. It's probably the best chapter she does, most useful chapter. And I recognise that we're struggling to get hold of copies of this. Now, what I've done is every single article she has talked about in that chapter is on the Blackboard site. So, and all essentially she's adding is some connecting narrative which you can get from the lecture. So do make sure if if you're going to have a look at this topic, that you do go back to those original those articles that are on the Blackboard site, because they're really helpful. How can those country of origin effects help with a brand evaluation? So I've talked quite a lot about familiarity already. It can help in terms of the development of the economy that they're deriving from. If the country that they originate from has got is very similar domestically to the country that the consumers are in, again, that can help because it makes the brand feel a little bit more acceptable. And if we don't understand the technical complexity of a product, then again it helps with acceptance of the innovation if the country is particularly favourably perceived by the country that we're entering. So this can be really important, particularly I think for your particularly for the marketing in a global context. Again, it might be useful for you to take these points on board. But country of origin can have this really important impact and effect, and can be really beneficial. We'll come to some of the limitations in a second. So this diagram from Yasin and Noor essentially just shows us how that country of origin image can help us be distinctive as a brand, so it can be a source of distinctiveness. We might feel loyal if that country is perceived favourably, and it helps with familiarity and awareness. So it makes the brand feel more familiar, and we know that familiarity breeds preference, which essentially all of this leads to us having greater brand equity. So we can leverage our country of origin. Potentially, we're looking for countries that derive similar meaning to the meaning we want to express around our brands. It can help us overcome some of those cultural aspects, but also help us build acceptability and market penetration too. So nationalism is it sort of feeds into this idea of consumer ethnocentrism, and it's all about, in the same way that we might accept a product because of its country of origin, in some instances that could be unfavourable, and we might reject a product because of its country of origin. Now, the level to which this has an impact is all down to our corporate susceptibility, and the corporate susceptibility is determined by the factors on the left. So how closely associated are we with our country? So is it really clear that we're an American brand, and actually this new market really hates America? How familiar and visible is the brand in itself? So it's kind of like this balancing act between is the country of origin kind of more prevalent and bigger than the brand itself. If the brand itself overrides and has likability in its own sense, then that country of origin doesn't have so much of an impact. So, for example, if Coca-Cola is liked as a brand, it has high market share and magnitude, it's familiar and visible, then even though it has that national association, the corporate susceptibility is less because we like the brand in its own right anyway. And this leads us to this diagram here on the next slide. So this just shows you, if you've got strong, as I was saying, if you've got a strong brand, and so therefore our corporate susceptibility is weak, then we're pretty much in a safe zone. This just tells us how nationalistic the country is. if the country we're entering is really nationalistic and very ethnocentric, so that means that they much prefer their own domestic brands to what might be perceived to be foreign brands, then you're pretty much in the safe zone. Obviously, if you have strong corporate susceptibility, so you're very susceptible as a brand, and the country has a strong nationalistic base, you're much more in a problematic area, so you're in that dangerous zone. So it's just something to kind of be aware of again in global markets. We might enter every single market not realizing that there potentially could be problems for us, but country of origin can be both beneficial for us, but it equally can have its limitations too. And it essentially depends on clearly the country and the culture that you're entering, but equally the one that you derive from too. Okay, so just to finish up then, guys, I hope you've sort of realised that the screencast has given the advice around culture is a really important and influential concept. It essentially helps us derive our meaning around our brands, which is what it's all about. So therefore, it does have an impact. And this can mean that if the culture is different in different markets we might be entering, then we need to have really careful management and think about, how do we take a localized or a standardized strategy? So if you want to look through what some of those options are, if you go back to the brand management lecture that we did a couple of weeks ago, where we started off with portfolio management, but we looked at how we might enter international markets. That will give you some kind of the benefits and limitations of that. Country of origin can be both positive and negative, so it might be something that we want to leverage and to our benefit, but equally we need to be mindful of when it could cause us problems, so when it might actually be a hindrance more than a help, and it's just something that obviously we need to be aware of.